Welcome to Module 6. In this module, we'll be talking about business strategy because it turns out that under certain market conditions, it's really important for us to think strategically about how we can plan for and react to what our competitors are going to be doing as we're trying to make decisions of how to price our products and how much to produce of our products to maximize profits. And so as we think about how competitive different markets are, we've kind of looked at the two extremes so far. We can think about the spectrum where as we go to the right, there's more competition and less market power. As we go to the left, there's less competition and more market power. Perfect competition was way over here on the right. And when we have perfect competition, every firm is just a price taker. You just have to set the price of your product at whatever everyone else is selling it at. And we're going to end up with price equals marginal cost, so no markup, and everyone would be making normal zero profit, economic profit in the long run. On the other end, we could think about monopoly, and there you'd have a lot more market power if you're the only firm controlling this good. Of course, it is going to depend on exactly how unique your product is and how desperate consumers are for your product versus other products they could get. In this case, we're going to have a markup where the price is greater than the marginal cost of selling the product. As we think about monopolistic competition, that's sort of where we have each firm sells a product, but all the products are somewhat different. And then in this case, it depends on how substitutable the goods are. So when you have monopolistic competition and the goods that firms are selling are pretty similar to each other, although maybe not exactly the same, the more similar they are, the more we're closer to this perfect competition model. And the more different the products are, the more it's the case that these goods are not really substitutes for each other, the more we're kind of in this monopoly scenario. What we want to look at in this module is oligopoly, which is also going to put us somewhere in the middle between these two extremes we've looked at of perfect competition and monopoly. And with an oligopoly, we're going to have a few firms competing on price and quantity. And if we have a few firms that are kind of competing on price, we could still have price pretty close to marginal cost if they are undercutting each other on price. You could have even 2 or 3 firms that if they're kind of setting price in order to be the lowest price competitor, the price could end up pretty close to marginal cost. But if you look at firms colluding to restrict output, we could end up with an outcome that looks a lot like a monopoly, depending on how exactly firms interact in an oligopoly. But the key thing with an oligopoly here is that unlike in perfect competition or in the monopoly scenario, we have to think about strategy or how to plan for and react to what other firms are doing. With perfect competition, you can just set your price at what everyone else is setting their price at. With a monopoly, you just set your price in a way that maximizes profit. There's no other firms to worry about. But with oligopoly, you have to think very carefully about how other firms will react to whatever you're doing. And of course, when both firms or all the firms are thinking about what other firms are doing, we have to think about kind of that best response that everyone's doing in this equilibrium that results. All right, so kind of our goal this time here is, first of all, to apply game theory concepts to understand strategy. So game theory is really the study of strategic decision making, and that'll be applicable as we think about business strategy in an oligopoly situation. So we can look at concepts of equilibrium. What would we expect to happen if both sides are incorporating their expectations of trying to maximize profit? We can look at when it's beneficial to make a decision first or when it's beneficial to make a decision second, if we have sequential decisions, or we can see what happens when firms are choosing to set their price or quantity at the same time. So we can look at those different sort of games or strategic scenarios. Second, we want to analyze conditions under which cooperation can emerge in repeated decision-making scenarios. So sometimes when firms are competing over and over again in a game, that can result in much different outcomes than if you just had a one-time game. And in some cases, we can end up with firms sort of coordinating to keep quantities lower and prices higher, even if it isn't necessarily intentional or some price fixing scheme. Third, we want to evaluate the effectiveness and challenges of strategic barriers to entry, such as limit pricing or capacity expansion. And so one way to kind of gain market power and have higher profits in the long run is to keep other firms out, maybe by keeping prices below a profitable level for a time, or committing to that to keep other firms from entering, or you could commit to expanding your capacity such that that will kind of signal that you're willing to produce a high quantity and sell at a low price. Number 4, we want to explain the principles and methods of price discrimination. That'll be in chapter 14. So there's different types of price discrimination, but the key thing here is going to be when you have some market power as a firm and you can prevent reselling of your product, it's going to be beneficial to sell at a higher price to people who are willing to pay more to extract more profit from them, while still selling to people that aren't willing to pay as much by selling to people that aren't willing to pay as much at a lower price. And so then you can make at least some profit on the people that aren't willing to pay as much, while making much bigger profit on the people that are willing to pay more. And that basic principle can play out in many different ways depending on exactly what the options are for the firm and what they know about their customers and how well they can segment them into different markets. And then lastly, we'll determine profit maximizing strategies for multiple products. Say we have multiple products that we're selling, we could bundle them together and sell them as just one bundle. That could be a strategy that is sort of like price discrimination and can be profit maximizing in certain situations. And then we also lastly want to assess the limitations of cost plus pricing, which is basically just the idea of taking your average cost per unit and marking that up by some fixed amount to get your price. The things due Thursday night will be, first you're going to watch this video and answer the kind of this quick question in response. And for our discussion this week, the first thing is a podcast from Planet Money looking at dynamic pricing and how that potentially could come to supermarkets near us. And then a short article looking at Wendy's and how they ended up deciding not to introduce surge pricing or a form of dynamic pricing. So dynamic pricing is just changing the price of the product across time in a flexible way. And that's one form of price discrimination, but there are some limitations to trying to do that. So I think that should be an interesting thing for us to discuss. And then for the end of the week, we'll look at chapters 13 and 14, which I'll briefly talk about here in a minute. And then we'll also look at the good, better, best approach to pricing, which is sort of one way to use multiple products in a way that can kind of price discriminate and maximize profits. So we'll look at that one. And then we wanted to kind of start looking towards the end here, since our last module is module 7, then the next one. And so I want to give you a little bit of time to begin preparing for the last multiple choice test. So that will be in module 7, but you can start preparing a little bit for it this week. It'll cover chapters 8 through 14 in the book. And then also I want to give you a little bit of time to work a little bit on your final project related to a government policy and how that could impact a business, and thinking about efficiency and some other things. All right, so chapter 13 is about strategic decision making in oligopoly markets. So that's one of our important market structures to consider, where we have a few firms that control a market, rather than a monopoly where we just have one firm controlling a market, or a really competitive industry where there's lots of firms in the market. And depending on how exactly these firms interact, you can end up with much different outcomes. So it depends a lot on the exact structure of how firms are making decisions. Who goes first? Are they choosing at the same time? What are they choosing? How are they making those choices? Are they focusing on setting a price or producing a quantity? We can have much different results depending on exactly how those strategic interactions play out. It gets complicated because we have a few firms, and each firm is going to impact each other firm. And because of that, we need strategy where you're taking into account the decisions of other firms when you are making your decisions. And you have to know that other firms are also taking into account your decisions when they're making their decisions, and that leads to this complicated strategic thinking. So first, if we have simultaneous decisions, I can give you one example here. So we could look at what happens. Maybe we could think about a game. A game is just, again, like a strategic scenario. And so let's say we have like two firms that are deciding how much to produce at the same time. And so maybe they could pick like a high quantity to produce or a low quantity to produce. So if they each could pick a high quantity or a low quantity, there's 4 possible outcomes. And what we're going to do in our game matrices is basically just lay out what the payoffs are, or what the profit is for each firm, depending on the combinations of actions. And the reason this is a game or a strategic scenario is that the payoffs depend not only on your own decision of producing a high or low quantity, but also the decision of the other firm. So the payouts are a function of both firms' choices. All right, so let's imagine that the best thing that they could do to maximize their joint profits would be to have them both produce a low quantity. So we'll indicate that here with $2 for each one. So the first number is the profit for firm 1. The second number is the profit for firm 2. And so maybe if they both produce a smaller amount, they can sell at a higher price. So maybe if they both sell at the lower quantity, that equals like what a monopolist quantity would be, and they can sell at the monopolist price. So that might be a good deal where they can sort of just like both act like half of the monopolist. But they might be tempted to each produce more to take over more market share and sell more. So maybe if they both sell higher quantity, they don't get as much profit, so they both get $1. But here's the issue. If you look at what their incentives are, they might have this incentive to produce the higher quantity. So imagine that you are firm 1 here, and you know that firm 2 is going to produce a lower quantity. You might want to pick a higher quantity to really take advantage of that and gain even more profits. And so your best response if they don't produce very much might be to produce a lot more, and vice versa. And so maybe the best scenario for both would be we both produce a small amount and get good amounts of profit, the $2 signs there. But maybe we end up in this other equilibrium here, where we end up with both producing a higher quantity. So maybe this is our equilibrium here, because if you look at their incentives, we can kind of draw arrows to show what the best response is. So if firm 1 is trying to make this choice, if they see that firm 2 is going to produce a high quantity, firm 1 gets this first number, and so they might kind of be indifferent between a high or low quantity if firm 2 picks a high quantity. But if firm 2 picks a low quantity, then we see that firm 1 gets more profit by choosing the higher quantity. In this case, that'd be symmetrical, so firm 2 would think the same thing. They're sort of indifferent between these two, but they would definitely rather pick a higher quantity if firm 1 picks a lower quantity. And so even though both picking a lower quantity would be good for both, they get this high profit, the $2 signs, we both end up with only $1 sign because this is not an equilibrium. When one side is, even though both sides producing a low amount would be profit maximizing for their joint profits, each firm has an incentive to kind of unilaterally deviate or kind of cheat the other firm by producing more to gain more for themselves. And that results in sort of this, what we'll call is like a prisoner's dilemma, where they end up in the worst outcome by producing what's best for them individually. And so that could be sort of a simultaneous decision. We could look at sequential decisions where maybe firm 1 chooses a quantity and firm 2 picks a quantity afterwards. And it turns out that there's some situations where it's better to go first and other situations where it's better to go second in a game like this. And so for choosing a quantity, it's often better to go first, actually, because you can kind of commit to picking this higher quantity and force them to pick a lower quantity. But if we're talking about price, a lot of times it's better to choose a price second, because if the other firm sets their price first, you can set your price second and undercut them and gain more of the market. It gets more complicated when we look at repeated decisions. So we could look at what happens if we play a game once in terms of setting prices or quantities. But that could be different when we play a game over and over again and firms interact over time. And this can lead to more potential for collusion, where firms keep quantities low to get prices high. If this is explicit, you have price fixing, this is illegal. Teamwork doesn't always make the dream work in that sense. But there can be sort of tacit collusion, or ways in which firms end up kind of doing this in ways that aren't necessarily illegal, or at least like they don't get caught as illegal. And so the more public prices are, the more firms sort of realize that it's not in their best interest to undercut each other on price over time, the more you could end up with an oligopoly situation, ending up with higher prices and lower quantities, which is sort of the problem with monopoly. And lastly, we could think about deterring entry. There's different ways we could do this, maybe by keeping prices low to deter firms from entering, or you commit to keeping prices below a profitable level if another firm enters. That's called limit pricing. Or you could try to commit to producing a high quantity by investing in higher capacity. All right, and then this is kind of one of my favorite topics, which is advanced pricing techniques. We're especially going to talk about price discrimination in Chapter 14. And again, the basic idea here is that with the single price monopoly, you're kind of forced into this dilemma. Do you want to sell more units but at a lower price, or do you want to sell fewer units at a higher price? And what price discrimination is going to allow you to do is, to some extent, or maybe to a great extent, kind of get the best of both worlds, where you can sell at a high price to people that are willing to pay more, and a lower price to people that are willing to pay less. And so you can still make some profit on the people that aren't willing to pay as much, and you can make a lot more profit on the people that are willing to pay more. And this is sort of a way to capture more consumer surplus. So if you think about what happens in a competitive market, supply. With a competitive market, we'd have our competitive price. Price equals marginal cost. So our competitive quantity. Our consumer surplus would be this triangle here. That would be our consumer surplus. What a monopolist is going to do is they're going to have this lower marginal revenue, so they have a lower incentive to sell more units. And so the monopolist quantity is going to be here, that monopolist quantity. So they're going to restrict the quantity to sell at a higher price. And this is going to allow the firm to gain more profits and take that away from the consumer surplus, or how much consumers are benefiting. And so really what happens here is this part of consumer surplus is captured and turned into profits for the monopolist, because for these units here, they now sell at a higher price. But then the downside here is that this part, this triangle here, becomes deadweight loss. It goes away because these units here are no longer sold. We had to reduce the quantity to sell at the higher price. But what we would like to do in a perfect world, we'll call this first degree price discrimination, if we can do this perfectly, would be to sort of try to capture all this consumer surplus. So what if we could charge each consumer exactly what they're willing to pay? So there's one person that's willing to pay the most, we charge them this high price. This person's willing to pay a little bit less, we charge them that price. This person's willing to pay more than marginal cost, but not much more, so we'll charge them just above marginal cost. And there's all these guys in between. If we charge everyone exactly what they're willing to pay, which is shown on the demand curve, then we could take all of this consumer surplus and turn this into producer surplus. So that would be first degree price discrimination, or perfect price discrimination, where you charge each consumer exactly what they're willing to pay. Now this is probably quite hard to do in practice, but that's sort of the main idea of trying to capture consumer surplus and turn it into more profit. Second degree price discrimination is going to be kind of trying to get people to reveal how much they're willing to pay, sort of using different prices for different quantities. So this would be like a bulk discount would be an example. People that are buying in bulk are probably more price sensitive, and so you might want to lower the price for them to get them to buy your product. They're also not willing to pay as much on the margin because they've already bought a certain number before. So people that are buying a lot of something are probably more price sensitive, and you might want to lower the price. People that are only buying one unit of something, they're probably less sensitive to price, so you might be able to raise the price on people that are not buying as much. So bulk discounts can be one way to get people that are willing to pay more to pay a higher price, and people that are willing to pay less to pay a lower price and still buy the good. Even though you don't necessarily know who those people are, you can get them to reveal it by charging different prices for different amounts of the good. Or we could look at two-part pricing, which is when we have like an access fee and then per unit price on top of that. So this could be like an amusement park where you have to pay to get in, and then you also have to pay per ride for certain rides. Now, this is also essentially what Costco does, where you have a membership fee to get in, and then you pay much lower prices. Prices pretty close to marginal cost. They're not making really a lot of profit on the actual products. They make most of their profit on the membership fees. And so that can also be a way to price discriminate in a similar fashion. Third degree price discrimination is going to be trying to identify different submarkets and charge different submarkets different prices. So this could be like a senior discount. You have to be able to verify who's in which market. It could be by location. And this can be a way to charge groups of customers more if they're willing to pay more, and charge groups of customers less if they're willing to pay less, and sort of get that best of both worlds. Multi-product strategies can include things like bundling, where you sell a whole combination of goods as a unit, like maybe like basic cable. You have like a cable package, or maybe you have like a combo of goods that always goes together. When you have consumers that have, some of them want to buy one and some of them want to buy other parts of the bundle, this can be an effective way to sort of price discriminate and make more profit off your consumers. And then lastly in the chapter, we look at cost plus pricing, which tends to not work as well, which is basically just taking your average total cost and adding kind of a fixed percentage on top of that. All right, so that'll give you a little bit of an idea to get you started. Let me know if you have questions as you go, and we'll talk to you next time.